In today's video, we'll be going over some police and detective stories. You guys seem to really like the last one I did. When was the last one anyways? Almost a whole month ago. Well, I'm always up for doing follow-up videos if you guys enjoy the first one, and this is just that. As always, a massive thank you to the writers, whose links can be found in the description. Remember, you can send in your own stories to rylhstories@gmail.com. If you enjoyed the video, please be sure to drop a like and comment. Subscribing if you're new is also very much appreciated. Enjoy the video, and as always, I hope you all have a great night. It always starts with something as light as a piece of paper. Something that can contain the weight of the world gently drifts onto my desk. This time was like any other. A slim white piece of paper dotted with the details of my next investigation. On top of the paper, Ellie was printed in bold ink, letting me know it was now my weight. The case was a little out of my office's jurisdiction, but still close enough that we could receive the go-ahead from local enforcement without much hassle. I took the rest of the workday to garner any details about the case that I could muster. 7 children had gone missing around St. Francis National Forest. It seemed like a pretty cut and dry investigation. The forest had an unusually dense fog rolling through every 6 months or two for the past 3 years. The children likely wandered into the forest to play in the fog and got disoriented. When attempting to get back home, they only wandered farther. There were some standout features that piqued my curiosity, like how none of the 7 bodies were found, even after aggressive search efforts went several miles into the forest. You'd think they'd find at least one of them, but they found nothing. The other curiosity is that there were signs that the children had been in the woods for 100 feet, but each time the tracks would just stop completely. I had heard of cases like this before. Many bizarre things have been reported by search and rescue rangers. Children disappearing and being found miles and miles from their last known location, or their bodies found strung up on top of trees. Perhaps the locals had something to do with it. I decided my first stop would be the town where all 7 children had lived. Things all thrown into my car, case file placed on the passenger seat. I headed to the store to gather supplies. Sitting in the driver's seat, I gently filled my metal flask with a clear, powerful fluid. Then I headed off. The drive over gave me time to run over every line of questioning and every possible outcome for those children. If my hunch was correct, I should be arriving around the time the fog starts rolling in, and I'll get a better feel for things. A few hours rolled by. I drove miles surrounded by nothing but forest, and a winding road decorated on occasion by another vehicle. I could see small tendrils of smoke reaching out from the tree line. My timing would be spot on. I saw dark shadows running from the oncoming fog, forest animals jumping from tree to tree. Then one of those shadows shot out from behind the trees and bounded into the road, right in front of me. I slammed my brakes and swerved to the side of the road, forcing myself to a halt. Even though the large buck had made its way to the other side of the road, I was worried I nicked it or damaged my bumper. I got out of the car and looked it over a few times. Luckily, there wasn't any damage in sight. As I looked down at the car, I could see the fog wrapping around my feet. It was getting so thick so quickly. If I was to make it safely into town, I'd have to hurry before my visibility was reduced to nothing. To my side, I heard leaves crunching under pressure. When I focused on the forest, I had a brief moment of shock. Looking through the trees at the rolling mist, I thought I saw a human figure staring me down. I blinked a few times, and then only saw it as another tree. Laughing it off, I got back in the car and drove off. I should have turned my car around and headed back to the office. Instead, I arrived in the small town after another hour had passed. By this time, the fog had swallowed up the forest around me. I could understand why kids would wander into it. There was a kind of alluring uncertainty about it. I had a pull to it. The town was quiet and cute. Small ranch houses and taverns littered the sides of the road, and if I drove for a handful of minutes, I'd quickly find myself on the other side of it. Rolling through it, I could have mistaken it for a ghost town, though. The streets were barren, the only clues of civilization being the lights coming out of nearly every house. The beams of light rested on the thin veil of fog projecting the residences. I looked through the case file and found the names of the missing children's families. They all had an address, but I'd be lucky if I could make out one number from my car thanks to the fog. Not to mention all these houses weren't exactly new. Number plates were missing or unreadable on several houses. I finally found my match and exited the car. Pacing up to the front door, I steeled my resolve. I always had to prepare myself to speak with victims. They always have a different air to them. My fist met the door's wood, and I waited on the porch. I could hear the pattering of footsteps and a low mumble from the other side of the door. A mumble that wasn't meant for me. Peering down, I could see the light coming from under the door. The fog made it easier to see the 2 feet obstructing the light. Someone was standing on the other side of the door. If I could just have a moment of your time, I began speaking before being interrupted. There's something in them there woods. A low droning voice slipped through the door, like another beam of light. A beam of light that went dark after the words were spoken, almost like a choreographed dance. The other lights in the house began to go out. I stepped away from the door, a little concerned. My line of work doesn't fit well with ominous, vague warnings. I planned to follow up with this house the next day, but at the same time I needed answers, and I wasn't getting them there. As I made my way back to my car, I couldn't help but notice a familiar cardboard box peeking out from their recycling bin. A 12-pack of my personal selection of heavy bubbles. Who was I to judge, though? My flask was already half empty. 2 more houses. I got the same reply each time. There's something in them there woods. When I attempted to follow up on what they meant, I got nothing but shutout. I still had 4 houses left though, and someone was bound to say something helpful. Anything I could grab onto. I found a little more luck with the next 4 houses. A man behind the door turned the handle and opened it. Meeting my eye line, I could see sad and tired eyes, glaring at me from between the small crack he afforded me. I asked about his son Tim. I told him that anything he could spare, I could use. Don't tell me there's something in the woods, I pleaded. He looked at me as if he understood I wasn't his first stop. He told me that Tim was always a curious kid, but he blanketed that curiosity in an awareness. Tim knew to turn back if he felt unsafe. The whole time I talked to the father, after our initial eye contact, his focus turned to that of the woods behind me. I couldn't help but notice his slouched posture and stuttering speech pattern, not to mention the smell on his breath. And if that wasn't enough, he pulled up the beer bottle and offered me one. Politely, I declined. Our conversation was over, and while I didn't get much from it, I got a better handle on the townfolk in general. Every house I'd been to so far, alcohol was there. In the trash or in the slurred speech trying to warn me of the woods. I couldn't blame them. Their children were gone without a trace, and every 6 months. The remainder of their disappearances wraps their town like a blanket. I spent a good amount of time on the 4th house's porch, staring at the woods, as the father had been. The trees seemed to be dancing like the fog was pushing them to and fro. My vision began blurring, and as it did, I thought for a moment I could see something a few trees in length slither across my view, obstructed by the forest. Before I could register the sighting, it was gone, and I passed it off. Maybe the flask was getting to me. The 5th house was the same nonsensical warning, through haggard breath. The 6th house, nobody was home. The only house in town with the lights already turned off. So far they had waited for my arrival before doing that, So I walked over to the lit house next door, speaking with the neighbor briefly, who was much more compliant in having a conversation. I asked what happened to the family next door. I was then told that the father had lost his mind and went into the woods a few hours before my arrival. I wanted to question the last family, but if I waited too long I'd have another missing case on my hands. I said my goodbyes to the neighbors and rushed off to my car. Unlatching the trunk, I pulled out a large bundle of thin yarn and a flashlight. A lot of good that was going to do in the fog. Against my better judgment, I filled up my flask and locked the car back up. The fog looked like it was taking on a life of its own. It was hard to distinguish the forest from the trees, so to speak. Reaching the tree line, I wrapped the yarn around the thickest tree I could find and made my way into the forest. In what seemed like only seconds, I was completely enveloped in the intense gray fog. I could only see a scarcity of trees around me. Before my vision would only pick up an endless gray. The yarn, bunched up in the palm of my hand, continued to unfurl between my fingers, the fibers brushing against my skin being the only sensory intake I had. The forest was incredibly quiet, like the fog itself was muffling any noise from the wildlife or rustling branches. I could feel the heavy fog entering my lungs, thousands of tiny water particles filling my throat with every inhale. The flashlight did its best and became more useful as the sun started to set, but was ultimately useless. Even as the sun was setting, it seemed as if the fog carried a light of its own, never dipping too far into the darkness. After I felt I was far enough away from the town, I began calling out Mr. Gallo's name, the man who decided to run into the forest. I didn't know how far my voice would travel, but it couldn't have hurt. My nerves were getting to me. I don't like drinking too much on the job, and I was isolated in a forest hoping my yarn could get me back home. Still, my fingers wrapped around the cold silver and pulled the top off. Smooth, clear vodka dripped into my throat, landing hard into my stomach. The warmth my body radiated as it processed the alcohol soothed me. It was then I first believed I saw him. A distant shadow in the fog, shorter than the surrounding trees. I called his name again, focusing the flashlight's beam on him. Several times my voice trailed out to reach for him. The shadow seemed like it was gaining distance on me, so I hurried my footsteps. Slowly my caution unraveled, as did the yarn between my fingers. I really should have been paying attention to how much I had left. My shoulders and knees banged against several trees and low-lying branches as I attempted to catch up with the shadow. A long, thin shape quickly passed between me and the shadow. Only for a breath did my nerves catch up to me. I stopped dead in my tracks and tried to observe the new figure, but by the time I turned my head, it was gone. So was the shadow I had been chasing. Looking around, I saw what I believed to be Mr. Gallo's in the distance. I ran, frantically this time towards him. I hadn't been this active since I was a beat cop, but now my work consisted of files and conversations. While I was running towards the figure, a single phrase repeated in my mind. A single silly warning. I thought of the long, strange shadow despite how hard I tried to place the blame on my drink of choice. I reached the shadow, and its features became clear, but it wasn't Mr. Gallo's. No. Sat down and hunched over the log in front of me. I recognized the small body and face of Timothy. He looked pristine and far calmer than I was. "What are you doing here?" I asked the boy. It shouldn't have been my first question or action, but I was so lost in the fog and in my head that I couldn't process that this boy, who had gone missing a year ago, was sitting in front of me, not a scratch on him. The boy looked up at me and gave me an impish smile. "There's something in them there woods." I was exhausted, and that phrase was the last thing I wanted to hear. I reached to the child. I wanted to get him out of the woods. My hand, when it pressed on the boy's shoulder, I felt his skin giving way. Like paper mache that hadn't dried yet. I stopped pressing the moment the sensation hit my nerves, and when pulling away I could see his skin become dented. Bewildered I met the child's eyes and he spoke. "You should go feed it." He continued as if no time had passed. His childlike voice sounded distant and distorted, like someone throwing their voice. I stumbled back, partly from the alcohol's effect on me, and honestly, I was scared. Maybe fear wasn't what I was feeling. I was feeling something beyond me. We fear that we don't understand, but when you don't know what you don't understand, my senses were thrown out of whack, and I was beginning to tremble as the boy stood up. We walked behind the tree and his body vanished, obscured by the thick bark. I could see dense particles of white fog plume from the other side of the tree. Pulling myself to my feet, I ran to the other side of the tree. Nothing. The boy was completely gone. No footsteps. Literally nothing. I remembered how the fog felt filling my lungs. I wondered if perhaps the fog had some hallucinogenic properties to it. I went to look a little farther, to see if I could find any trace. I was desperate for anything tangible. Then I felt it. The small tip of thread slipped from between my fingers. The yellow yarn had run out. I looked back. I was ready to leave and write whatever reports I had to. I wasn't getting lost in the woods. It wasn't there. The bright yellow yarn that should have been sitting on the fallen leaves, trailing back to safety, was nowhere in sight. I haphazardly stumbled around looking for it, but just like the boy, it had vanished, leaving nothing. My heart was in a flurry, pounding hard enough to snap my ribcage. Nothing but gray was surrounding me, an endless floating ocean before me. It only occurred to me that I hadn't seen a single hint of wildlife the entire time I was in there, and even when chasing the shadow, the only noise was my own. I wasn't thinking rationally. I started screaming for something or someone. I wanted someone to hear me. Maybe Gallows was still around. With each desperate cry, more and more fog plumed into my breath. It had started to feel like I was poorly treading water. Small slivers of water dripping between my lips. I was drowning in the forest. Standing on soil, I felt like I was going to drown. Then a beacon of hope. A small light broke through the never-ending gray. I could see the orb of a flashlight. Even if it was ineffective, it was something. Relief washing over, I'd be happy just to be lost with someone. I headed towards the unmoving light. I turned my own flashlight off as I approached, as did they. I stood just a few feet away, able to see the woman's features, able to see my own face peering back at me. The same impish smile that Timothy wore. Everything about her was just the same as me, down to the small bronze badge she had pinned to her arm. It was me, a perfect reflection of me, except for the smile. We stood for far too long, locking eyes, her bright blue eyes. Her short black hair and beauty marks, they were all mine. I scanned for a lifetime looking for something that set us apart. Other than her increasingly ominous grin, I saw nothing. "You should feed it," she spoke to me, a distant and uncanny reflection of my voice. After the words sat in the heavy air for a moment, I watched a long shadow reach from behind a nearby tree and grab my copy. I only saw it for an instant. The large bone-like arm that was pulling her away like she was being yanked by wires. A sense of direction and self-preservation be damn. I ran after the doppelganger that looked like she was flying in reverse. I did my best to get sights on her, but the thing dragging her was much faster. Finally, when I thought I couldn't bear to run anymore, when my thighs were running, burning muscles for energy, my doppelganger came to a rest. It was then that I was able to fully take in what the long shadow I had been seeing was, even if I still didn't understand it, as my eyes followed its long snake-like body. Its structure was about as thick as a normal human male, but it was well over 24 feet long, body resembling something more like bone than flesh. It floated in the mist like it was swimming. 3 white segmented arms that resembled the texture of bamboo jutted out from each side of its body, near its ghastly face. A morbid, decaying rendition of a bear's skull, oblong and covered in sickly green moss. It looked at me with empty eye sockets as it hovered over my copy. It didn't have anything to note other than just being some macabre collection of large bones. It dwarfed me in both size and comprehension. It knew what I saw when I looked at me, but I was at a complete loss remembering how the trees seemed to move on their own. I considered the thing's massive body pushing them around. It braced itself on the ground using its 6 long limbs to clutch the dirt beneath it, holding its floating mass in place. Its face lowered to my doppelganger. The moss that covered its mouth separated and it began to, what I could only assume, inhale. My body double, still smiling, began to warp. Her face started to turn into particles that drifted like mist into the creature's open maw. I could only watch as the thing converted my doppelganger's mass into a fog, as it breathed me in. The more of my doppelganger that vanished, the more empty I started to feel. The more lightheaded I became. Raising my hand to my head, I intended to press my fingers against a headache I had acquired. As my fingers met my skull, I could feel the skin pressing down like there was no skull underneath. Panicked, I pulled my hand away, noticing the entirety of my doppelganger's head was nothing more than a fine mist. The fog that was being devoured seemed to wrap the thing's already massive body, like a thin white layer of silk, adding to its mass. I was sure I was going to either die or be stuck in the forest forever, waiting for the fog to roll in so I could manifest for just a while. My fingers pressed over the small silver flask and gently, as to not distribute my empty head, I pour as much of the fine vodka down my throat as I could muster. I wanted to retch it up, but did everything I could to resist the urge, instead drowning the rest of it. Feeling weak, flask empty, I fell to the ground and watched the thing sucking in the fog's reflection of me. Its ugly mockery of a mouth reached my doppelganger's stomach, and I thought of the booze in my own that would hopefully make this process easy on me. As the monster began to convert the doppelganger's abdomen into fog, the particles reached into its structure and it began shaking, gently at first but growing more violent. It had a stroke of intuition as it continued to pull the contents of my doppelganger's stomach in to cover its bone structure. "Drink up," I chuckled, as the particles of my doppelganger rested on the monster. A perfect copy of me, stomach full of my favorite. Top shelf 151 proof vodka. A nasty drink that'll turn yellow teeth into a sparkling white in minutes. The thing's fist began pounding the ground, leaves lifting up from each vicious impact. It looked over to me and made a vicious roar, mimicking my own voice as best it could. Shaking and seemingly struggling to continue floating, it quickly swam away into the now retreating fog. The tendrils of mist started to lift, and with it, I watched my doppelganger become one with it. I laid there for a long time, watching as the fog retreated, allowing me to see the true vibrancy of the forest. As the fog lifted, I could feel myself returning. Pressing my fingers to my forehead, I could feel the hard resistance of my skull. I passed out, but I'm pretty sure that was due more from the alcohol that I ingested. The alcohol that, once I woke up, became one with the forest floor. I thought the headache I felt when my doppelganger was being absorbed was the worst I had. But downing the entire flask in seconds gave way to something much worse. I made my way out of the fog following the yellow thread that had reappeared, stumbling far more time than I cared to admit. My whole body washed with calm as I reached the tree line once more. Stumbling out of the nightmare, I could see the quiet little town. Good work. A gruff caught my attention before I could walk farther. The man was gruff and worn, his white shirt and blue jeans giving off a cowboy vibe. The truck he had his back rested against, old and rusted. I could just barely see the carcass of a deer laid out in the bed of his truck. A bottle rested on the hood of his truck labeled spiritus, with water-clear liquid pooled inside. He stepped over to me and handed me a small card, and spoke once more before he walked to his truck and drove off. There's no longer anything in those woods. We'll be in touch. After I hand in this report, I'm going to resign. I saw something that I couldn't believe existed before seeing it, and now that I have, I can't believe there aren't more things like it. I'll be okay. I know this report will be received as nothing more than a mental break from reality, but I'm pretty sure I have another job lined up. I'm a police officer in the UK. I wish to tell you about the strange cases I and my coworkers have been on. I cannot specify all the details, such as names of places or colleagues, so they may be removed or changed. A 999 call from Redacted. They left no message and all we could hear was white noise. I and my colleague, Officer Chris, were sent out to Redacted in order to find out what seemed like another prank caller. We drove for 5 minutes. Upon arriving to the street we had never seen before, we could see that none of the houses along the left side were occupied, due to the raggedy for sale signs at each porch, and along the right side, a school. The report said it was on the right, right? Affirmative, Anna, answered Chris. We parked the car outside the chain link fence. At first glance we could both clearly see that the main gate was locked, with a rusted master lock, which hadn't been used in years. We searched the perimeter of the fence to see if we could find an opening. In the end, we returned empty-handed. Even if we had gotten through the fence, none of the windows were open, and there were no doors to be seen on the exterior of the building. After starting the car back up, we began to drive back to base, to report that there was a high uncertainty that there would be anyone in that decrepit school, but were interrupted by Sergeant Rick on the walkie-talkie after 2 minutes of driving. This is Sergeant Rick. We got another report coming from the same building you're at. Chris and I looked at each other, made a U-turn and went back. This time, however, when we parked, we were completely dumbfounded to find that the chain link fence gate was gone. Not only that, a double-door entrance to the school was clearly visible and open. That wasn't there before, right? Negative, winced Chris. Immediately we followed our orders to search the building and went inside. The interior was filled with thrown paper, folders, and stationery. It were as if someone stopped what they were doing, dropped everything, and ran away from this desolate place. Looking up we could read, Redacted School for Mentally Ill Students. The name of this place rang a bell for some reason. I queried Chris about this, and he just shrugged blank-faced. On the left and right were award cabinets, empty. Farther down the corridor was a left and right corridor. I went left and Chris went right. On the right corridor wall was a light switch. Chris tried it and lights started to flicker brightly on and off. We could see that the corridors went down the entire length of the school, and were about 100 meters each way, but decided to turn them off, as they were distracting, and only occasionally flickering on. We parted ways and told each other that if anything happens, to talk on walkie-talkie channel 4. Flashlight in hand, I looked for any signal of distress, or even life itself. It seemed like everyone just disappeared all simultaneously. Searching each classroom was repetitive, but the initial opening of the door was frightening. There were no windows on the doors, so you couldn't see into them before entering, and each was heavy and fit with rubber on the seams for soundproofing. My walkie buzzed. I have found what seems like blood. Is it fresh? No, it looks like it dried centuries ago. I'll keep searching. Straight after I put my walkie back, a shrill shriek came, resonating through the corridor. Fumbling, I reached for my walkie again. Did you hear that? Calm down. What did you hear? The noise was so high-pitched and loud it still rang in my ears. I couldn't believe he didn't hear it at all. Could we check rooms together?
Yeah, good idea.
I ran down Chris's lane, and we caught each other halfway. We resumed searching for a short period of time, as I heard the noise again in a crossroad type area. This made the resonance much greater. I held my ears in pain, and Chris asked, unaffected, "Are you okay, Anna?" Clearly in pain, I replied, "Not really. We could stop this here, go back to base, and get more recruits." "That sounds great." I was cut off by the sound of walking footsteps coming towards us. Evidently, Chris heard them too this time, as he whisper shouted that we get back to back, and be prepared for an assault. The footsteps came faster and louder, until they were sprinting straight towards them from in front, behind, to the left, and to the right of us. We withdrew our firearms, gun in right hand on top of our left hand holding the flashlight. Chris then had the intelligent idea to move out of the center of the crossway. Pushing each other out into a single corridor, we dived into the front of another empty metal cabinet and the wall. Chris held my mouth shut so my hyperventilating wasn't heard, warmly stroked my shoulder, and hushed in my ear to calm me down. We turned off our flashlights and our pistols were still on safety. The running stopped. For what seemed like 3 minutes after the running stopped, I'd composed myself and we decided to peek the corners of the crossway. Since we had our backs to the right wall, we could immediately see nothing in front or behind us, or to the left. We looked right. A dark humanoid figure stood motionless. Its head pointed at the ebony knife it held in its hand. A faint tapping noise could be heard, blood dripping from its knife. We took a step back. Chris readied his pistol and turned the corner again. He lowered his gun and, paranoid, he frantically searched for other corridors. I've never seen Chris as terrified as this. He is normally cool-headed, composed, and not afraid of anything. So to see what was disturbing him so much, I turned the corner to find that the figure disappeared. There was no blood under where the figure was. I was confused and panicked, but Chris has a knack of calming me down, requesting backup immediately. Chris tried to say into the walkie, composed as can be. A gargled response came back from Sergeant Rick. "We are in urgent need of backup. Armed suspect holding a bloodied knife." Again, more gargles came from Sergeant Rick's side. We decided that base wasn't going to do us any favors, and we needed to find the exit. Not knowing which way we came from, we went down the one leading left. Running down the corridor, we heard a yelp. We both turned and saw the dark figure holding a child by the neck. The child attempting to pull away from the figure's hands, but it was simply moving through. The hands acting like liquid, moving around the boy's fingers. Due to the dark color and inconsistency of the liquid, it took me a few seconds to realize who this boy was. 4 years ago, I was on a case where apparently a boy the age of 16 had broken out of an asylum and into a school. I distinctly remember the figure held on to that child like before. That knife was dripping his blood. The boy lay on the schoolyard lifeless. I held no force against the perpetrator. I was useless. The MI5 was on the case, and many higher-ups for the fact that the boy was never found. The only evidence left at the scene was an ebony knife. The knife was tested for fingerprints, blood DNA, anything that could help. Nothing was found as the substance itself was tested, and didn't match to any known elements. And after being securely vaulted, it was stolen or simply vanished. In the figure's other hand was the ebony knife. A quick thrust and the child stopped struggling. Chris looked away in shame as he stood there doing nothing. Looking back at the crime scene, nothing was found. Our eyes widened as we returned to looking for an exit. We found the entrance which said, "Redacted School for Mentally Ill Students." The doors were closed and wouldn't budge. Chris and I repeatedly rammed our shoulders into the doors to no avail. I heard the high-pitched noise again. It came from straight behind us. The figure stood there with its jaw impossibly wide open, at a 180-degree angle. Chris took initiative and began shooting it. The bullets moved through its liquid body unaffected. I took out a taser, knowing electricity and water don't mix. It shook rapidly, its head moving back over its mouth, and fell to the ground as a puddle of water. A gel substance and what looked like soot. But we're really not too sure anymore. The doors behind us had somehow vanished, leaving a gaping hole in the entrance of the school. We ran out as fast as we could.
This is Sergeant Rick. What's your current status?
He said this as if he's been saying it for 6 minutes straight. I think we should just talk at base, I said, rushed, as I got into the car to head back as soon as possible, to the safety of the police department. After stating everything that happened, we were interviewed to see if we were telling the same story. The MI5 and government officials were back on the case. Previously, they didn't check the asylum that the report said the boy came from, as the location was unknown. They only had a name that no one heard of. When they arrived to what Chris and I thought was a school, they had more numbers and tasers. They checked our floor that we searched, upstairs, downstairs, and the basement. The floor was just as we reported. Soundproof doors, blood. Looked like a classroom. Upstairs was the same. Downstairs was a lunch hall, but the basement had several hundred small prison cages, lined along 2 walls, then splitting off into a T-junction. Scratches on the walls, and even more blood. They found bloodied instruments of torture, and a jar of black substance, in each cell that the asylum members supposedly drank from. Nothing else emerged from this case, as there was not a single person in sight, or any clues to where several hundred people went, as there were no bodies found either. For the scale of this building, it was surprising that there was not a single bit of graffiti, or vandalism was found either. It's as if the building can appear, disappear, and change form, maybe even change location.